remember really loving Drew Barrymore in the movie Firestarter. I adored all of the little outfits that she wore along the way. Not that there were many, but I did thoroughly enjoy them because I was a little girl myself. So. Stephen King wrote this book in the late 70s, and this was his 8th book. And I'm saying 8th because I'm also including the 2 books that he actually authored under his pen name. His pen name was Richard Bachman, I believe. But at any rate, he published Firestarter under Stephen King, and this was his 8th book that had been published at the time. I think I got that wrong in one of the videos prior to this. But this was his 8th book that was published. And he was a very young man at that point, in like his mid-20s or so. And although this isn't a super old book, it is fairly old. It was written started to be written around the mid-70s, and it was completed in 1979, and it was published in 1980. And so, I guess that is a pretty old book, but not as like old as like the classics or anything, you know. So it's not too far back that I couldn't help, after completing the book yesterday, I couldn't help but try to tie some of the things that were going on in the United States with things that he put into this book. I definitely think he was inspired by current events when writing this book, for sure. The genre that most people, and I believe what it's categorized as, science fiction, but it's also a thriller as well, for sure. It is a thriller. So science fiction, thriller, and also a little bit of horror. I mean, this is Stephen King we're talking about here. So, science fiction, thriller, horror is sort of where this book fits. That being said, if you're not comfortable with those topics, of course, avoid the video, but I promise you I will keep things as light as I possibly can. Stephen King, he has definitely been personally interested in government conspiracies, and so this book is definitely about that. Let me read for you the description of the book on the back. Andy McGee and Vicki Tomlinson were once college students looking to make some extra cash, so they volunteered as test subjects for an experiment orchestrated by the clandestine government organization known as the Shop. The Shop. The Shop. The Shop. The Shop. But the outcome unlocked exceptional, latent, psychotic talents for the two of them, manifesting in even more terrifying ways when they fell in love and had a child. Their daughter, Charlie, has been gifted with the most extraordinary and uncontrollable power ever seen. Pyrokinesis. possibly false, but and maybe at the time they were conspiracy theories, but now the two things that I want to mention right now are in our recorded history, so they aren't conspiracy theories, they're the truth. The first thing that might have impacted or influenced Stephen King to write something like this was a real experiment where drugs that are currently illegal were given to people in order to see if they had any type of telekinetic type of powers or could perform telekinesis, mind control. These were really happening around the time that Stephen King graduated from college. And of course, around that age, you have a lot of questions that are being asked of yourself and of things around you for the very first time. I'm sure Stephen King was no different. Another thing that happened a few years after he graduated college was also something put on by the government where a venereal disease is what it was called at that time. Now we call them STIs. Basically a very treatable venereal disease that the medical community knew could be treated easily with penicillin. They actually found subjects that had the venereal disease and withheld proper treatment so that they could see how the disease developed over the lifetime of humans. So they did not give these individuals any medicine for that treatment, and which led to, of course, spreading of the venereal disease to partners, to children, and sometimes this particular disease was fatal. And so having that happen around the same time, I think also influenced Stephen King. Many of you might know it as the Tuskegee experiment. I think the medical community calls it the Tuskegee study. But basically it was only done on black men during that time frame, and the experiment went from the 40s all the way to 1972. It did not end until 1972, so that would have been right before Stephen King wrote the novel, or began writing the novel, Firestarter. And it was a big deal. It was something that was all over the news at the time, from what I understand. So there was a lot of distrust of the government, and so having this book where you have a man named Andy running from a car that has been following him and his small child, his daughter, Charlie, was a very scary thing to think about in 1980 when this book was published, even still at that time. Andy, the dad, truly loves his little girl, Charlie, and he is trying to do anything that he can to protect her at all costs. Unfortunately, the people who are chasing them are doing so at all costs as well. And honestly, they're creating a huge whirlwind of activity that they always have to go back and sort of cover their tracks about. But since they have a budget, they have enough money to do so. Hush money or cover-up money was always available to them. Of course, little Charlie and her dad Andy, knowing that anytime other people's minds, and therefore control their actions and things. Also, which the book didn't go a lot into, little Charlie also has some type of power like that, because maybe not over people, but over objects, because she was able to get more money for her and her dad by getting them out of the telephone booths. So, and that was what allowed for Charlie and Andy to continue running from the people in the unmarked car that were always there. They were on the run, and the run started from New York and led them to upstate New York. And then they started hitching rides to different places. And the unmarked car was hot on their trail, but both of them, Charlie and Andy, were very smart, very bright. And so they were able to get cab drivers to drive them places, thinking that the money that they were being handed was a $500 bill whenever it was a $1 bill, or different things like that along the way. So anytime that Andy had to use his telekinesis, he thought of it as a push. That anytime he needed someone to do something for him, he needed to mentally push them in the direction they needed to go. And sometimes he would also, while pushing, use his voice in a conversation with them as well to help it sort of be more solid. And so as the story goes along, you come to see, as they are being chased by the unmarked car, and the story is advancing in the present. Whenever they get a little bit of downtime and they're able to rest a little bit, Andy will think about something from the past, and we as the reader get a chance to experience that with him. And we got a glimpse back to see how he and his college sweetheart Vicky, that I mentioned reading on the back of the book, how they met whenever they both participated in the experiment for the $200 in college, and how that moment really bonded them together. And of course, love blossomed, and they got married, and then came along Charlie. What they were injected with was done to them by this entity called the shop. So the shop, the clandestine service branch that was assigned to give Vicky and Andy this experimental drug called Lot 6, which tells you there must have been more people experimented on prior to them, was that it was a hallucinogenic drug, and that, anything that they saw being done to other participants in the experiment was likely a hallucination. Of course, this is a Stephen King novel, and so you can only imagine the descriptions of the things that were happening to the other people being experimented on in that room with young and naive Andy and Vicky. They, of course, trauma bonded over this and got married and had little Charlie. Unbeknownst to them, for a while, they were being observed by the shop, because, of course, they wanted to 6, got married and had a child. They were very, very, very interested in little Charlie. And then you might flash back to the present, and Andy and Charlie have to move to a new and different location. And then once they get a moment's rest, you might have Andy or Charlie thinking back on a memory, and you find out what happens to Vicky. You find out what causes Andy and Charlie to be on the run this time, and eventually those flashbacks catch up to the present. And then we learn more about the key members of the shop. We learn about the doctor, a little bit more about the doctor who initially injected Vicky and Andy. Whenever we're first introduced to the shop a little bit more intimately, that doctor is there. We also learn what happens to that doctor. We also learn that the shop has all types of employees, all regardless of whether or not they're hired as a gardener, a cook. All of them have military training. Even the receptionist does as well. And the shop employs a hitman as well. If you remember, I told you about how chasing down the people that were a part of this experiment left a whirlwind of activity behind the people in the car, the employees of the shop. They would do anything by any means necessary to try to get the information that they needed on these people, and in this case, in order to try to capture Andy and Charlie. And so we flash back to a present where Andy has run out of money. Little Charlie is just an exhausted, tired, and hungry child. And they come to need to rely on the help of strangers in order to advance any further. And they do get some help along the way. Unfortunately, in one of these scenarios, little Charlie has to use her pyrokinetic abilities in order to keep her, the Good Samaritans, and her dad safe. And so now the shop knows that little Charlie does in fact have powers, being the offspring of 2 people that were injected with Lock 6. Now, I've kept a lot of detail out of what I've explained so far. So if you are here for information on whether or not you should read Firestarter, I'll go ahead and give my rating to you now of this book. 4.75. 4.75. Also, I've just always loved Stephen King, so take that as you may. But I love the pacing of a Stephen King book. I always have. I did not understand what that even meant when I was first reading these as a teenager, but now having read a lot more books over that time period all the way up until now, it's the pacing, the flashbacks that are so natural throughout the story. The way that Stephen King can take a very ordinary thing and make it sound absolutely beautiful is amazing to me. And he doesn't do this in every sentence of the book either. you'll just be reading as the plot is progressing, or you're reading during a flashback, and then he'll describe how cigarette smoke goes out of a rolled down window, and it is just poetry. That actually really happens in this book. Oh, let me find it for you and read it. But the absolute way that he can make something sound that's so ordinary sound poetic is absolutely amazing to me. 4.75 stars. Now I'm going to get into spoiler central with Firestarter. Okay, spoilers ahead, spoilers ahead. For those of you still here and who are relaxing with me and know that you're not going to read Firestarter, this is an extra treat for you for sure. But, so I mentioned that there are hitmen employed by the shop. The doctor that actually did the injections on Andy and Vicky whenever they were both in college is there. But there's also a sort of head person running the shop, which is what this experiment has been ran under. His name is Cap. And Cap basically makes sure that the shop has a hitman, because as more and more people have to be paid off, or there's more liabilities, he takes care of them with the hitman, which his name is John Rainbird, who is a vet, an indigenous American vet. And John Rainbird, of course, they treat him at this point in time in history, they treat him as if he's just a not smart person who is the hired muscle for when they mess up. But he's actually a mastermind in this book. A mastermind that figures out how to break little Charlie. But before he does that, he's been asked to get rid of a liability. One of the liabilities along the way actually becomes the doctor who ran the experiment to begin with. Because that doctor actually realized, having seen what she did to some of the agents of the shop whenever they caught up with them at the Good Samaritan's house, she exploded them in fire that they had no time to run from or take shelter from. And that doctor was basically getting more and more threatening to Cap, the person over the shop. And so Cap, although Cap was getting a lot of good information from the doctor who ran that experiment, he also felt as if that doctor would eventually go above his head and say it was too dangerous to continue, and therefore the funding for Cap's program, the shop, would be cut off. So before the doctor had a chance to do so, he had John Rainbird eliminate that possibility. And of course the shop was able to cover it up. this is the government doing it. So the mail was interrupted and taken, and they read the letters, and they decided it was time to strike and go ahead and capture Andy and little Charlie. And they sent in Rainbird and were able to basically tranquilize them both and capture them and take them back to the shop headquarters. Back at the shop headquarters, Andy and little Charlie were actually separated while they figured out the best strategies in order to have them both display their talents in order for them to try to see what would be useful for national security purposes. Little Charlie was having some PTSD surrounding the things that she had done at that Good Samaritan's house to the agents of the shop that were chasing them. She had vowed never to make fire ever again, and she would not perform whenever they would ask her to do tests. She would not do it, not do it, not do it, not do it. And Andy also decided not to do it, not to do it, not to do it, not to do it, as well, for different reasons. They also decided to drug Andy with a drug that kept him from being able to do telekinesis or mind control, because they knew that they would be subject to that mind control. So in earnest, he wasn't able to do any mind control because he was being heavily drugged, and therefore he wasn't able to display to them what he could do. But they were not as interested in what Andy was able to do. They were more interested in what little Charlie was able to do instead, because she was more of a untapped potential, and they had already figured out that Andy, the dad, his abilities were waning over time. Each time he used his abilities, it affected his brain in a negative way that got worse and worse. He got worse and worse headaches and fatigue every time he did a push. So it was John Rainbird who decided and created the plan that he was going to earn the trust of little Charlie by disguising himself as an orderly who came in to clean her room every day, and through that daily exposure, Charlie would begin to trust him, and that's exactly what happened. And eventually, they also decided that her dad, Andy, must not have any talent left. However, it only took them letting their guard down one time during an electrical blackout, and because they decided to cut corners, the government agency, the shop, cut corners and hired someone's brother to control the generators of this property when the lights went out due to a storm, a very bad storm that kept the lights out for a while. The generators did not pop on for 7 hours. And so since those cameras were off, Dad Andy decided that since he wasn't given his medicine to drug him up on a regular basis because everything was in lockdown whenever the power was off, that he basically could push himself, use his skill on himself to make him not want any more of those drugs, because they were highly addictive drugs as well, and so that made him want to have them all the time. because they thought basically he was just a washed up, useless drug addict. They didn't really check after him as much as they should have. They didn't watch as closely as they should have, because up until the point where he convinced himself he didn't need the drug anymore, he was greedily asking for more drugs because it was a highly addictive drug that they gave to him. So they just thought he was washed up drug addict with no telekinesis abilities. But what they didn't know is that he knew that they could not watch him during that 7-hour period, and he weaned himself off of the drug, but was still given an opportunity to push someone that he had access to, and unfortunately he pushed him too hard, and that person ended up passing away. And he was questioned about it, but they again still thought he was a washed up person on drugs, and that, he was useless to them, and so they didn't expect anything to come from him, but he used that opportunity to push the person who was interviewing him. And Dad Andy came up with a great plan by convincing this person to go get Charlie and have a meeting point to escape. Well, that plan didn't go as planned, and unfortunately, John Rainbird ended up hurting Charlie's dad badly, and Charlie retaliated on the shop. She then finds herself, through hitchhiking, etc., finds her way back to the Good Samaritans that took her and her dad in when the shop came and caught up with them. And she stayed with them for a while, but they were beginning to worry about their safety, because the shop had already given them much money after the last incident. But they couldn't turn Charlie away. They knew that she informed them about her father, and she was a child. And they were talking one night about what to do with Charlie, because rumors were flying, things were heating up around town, and they went to bed saying they didn't know what to do. But Charlie, who had listened to the lessons of her father and knew that whenever he was writing the letters to the news agencies to tell everyone about what the government was doing to them, she understood that she needed to go to a news agency that wasn't government-led or in the pocket of the government. And she went to a library. She ran away from the Good Samaritan's home and ran to a library, and was able to get some information on a news agency that at that time in real life she went to. Stephen King writes the name of a magazine that was known at that time as being very revolutionary, and the book takes you to her navigating the city on her own, and she's in New York City. She makes it to New York City by hitchhiking rides and stuff like that, because at this point she had been doing that for a few years with her dad, and she had seen so much she wasn't afraid of much. And at any rate, they take you on the elevator with her, and other people are kind of looking at, why is this little girl by herself? But it's New York City, so people basically mind their business. And the news agency magazine that she chose to go and tell the stories to was the Rolling Stones in the book. What a great ending. shop was doing in order to cover their tracks, and what they were doing to this little girl and her dad along the way. Just chilling stuff. And so that is kind of the rest of the book Firestarter for those who wanted to talk about it. I think that it probably took a lot of bravery by the publishing house who first published Firestarter in 1980 to do so. Of course, there was an increase in trust in the government at that point versus 5 years earlier, but the thing about it is that the people that were alive to get this book and read it were probably old enough and alive to know what happened 5 years, 10 years earlier in the real world. And so King really knew how to ride the fears of those who were, adults in the USA who had thoughts about different types of conspiracies that were happening at the different levels around them. Firestarter has been one of my most highly rated books so far in 2026 because it's a thriller that also pulls at the heartstrings. It also has this beautiful writing by Stephen